Hello and welcome. My name is Dixie and this channel is where I share my historical sewing adventures. This project came about because I wanted to use up some of the things that I had in my stash. Mainly because I can't really go out and buy anything new right now. So I opened up my costume supply drawer and this is what I found. I had several small pieces of silk taffeta, just enough coutil to eke out about one corset, yards and yards of bone casing, some embroidery floss, a few pre-cut flat steel bones, and this Laughing Moon corset pattern. If you are a historical costumer, you are no doubt familiar with this pattern. It is the go-to pattern that everyone uses for their first Victorian corset, and I am no exception. Back in 2015, when I was starting my historical sewing journey, I used this pattern to make my very first corset. And since then, it has served me well. But as with anything you make for the very first time, it's not perfect. The shape is fine, it does its job, but it doesn't exactly give that super curvy hourglass silhouette that you would expect from the Victorian period. This pattern comes with two versions, the door corset, which is shorter and is made with vertical panels all the way around, and the Silverado corset, which is longer and has bust gores. So I made the Silverado corset. Now when I cut out this pattern, I had not yet read this very helpful article from Truly Victorian on how to properly choose your size. So my bust gores were way too big. But because I had not made a mock-up like I should have, I had to make the fix on the actual corset itself. And instead of taking it apart, I just chose to tuck the excess fabric into the seam and stitch it down by hand, which is a totally reasonable way of doing it, I guess. Also, this corset is designed to hit at mid-bust, not over bust or under bust, but mine is definitely a little tall, which tells me I probably needed to shorten it in the torso. My corset is made of coutil with a cotton lining. The velvet ribbons are purely decorative. I added those for a cosplay. They don't actually add anything to the corset structurally at all. The grommets in the back are big. I originally tried to use smaller grommets and I tried to set them with this weird little plier tool, but that totally did not work. So in a pinch, I had to go to the big box fabric store and buy a kit, but these were the smallest size that they had, and they're not even real grommets, they're eyelets. So the difference between grommets and eyelets are eyelets don't have the little metal circle in the back. So the back of my corset just has these scratchy little metal bits folded back to keep the eyelet in place, which is not structurally sound. Another issue, the corset itself is too long for the busk that I had. That combined with the thick binding at the top and the bottom means that the binding tends to pull apart while I wear it. Oh, and this corset does not have a waist stay, because way back when I thought, I don't need a waist stay. That just seems like an extra piece that's unnecessary. It was totally necessary and I should have done it. So a waist stay is a piece of twill tape sewn along the seam lines at the waist that prevents the waist seams from pulling apart and tugging those threads. So it helps hold the whole thing together. Including this corset, I have made 5 corsets or stays from various time periods and out of various materials. So I'm feeling pretty confident in my skills, and I thought that this would be a really fun challenge to use the same pattern that I made way back when again, but with all of the skills that I've learned with better materials, techniques, and improved fit. That means doing a proper mock-up, taking my time, being nitpicky about fit and measurements and details, and just making sure that I do things right. Because while I can be a perfectionist, I can also get really tired of a project halfway through and just want to be done with it. So if I really want to compare my skills and quality from back then to now, I really have to do my best work. So with that being said, let's get to sewing. Since I didn't have all the supplies I needed on hand, I ordered them online, as well as some other supplies I plan to use for future corsets. I love how this project started out as a stash busting idea, but then I ended up buying more supplies to add to my stash in order to use up the supplies that I already had. Anyway, while I waited for those to arrive, I took some scrap fabric and made a mock-up of the corset. I'm using a zipper to close it in the front and inserted a 2-inch wide strip of fabric in the back in place of the lacing. I inserted those leftover steel bones in the seam lines to give some idea of a shape, but I may have lost one of the side bones out in the backyard. Yes, I was gardening while wearing a corset mock-up, which may seem silly, but at least I know it's comfortable enough to wear while bending over and picking weeds. For our first try, the fit isn't bad. Mainly, I just need to tweak the curves here and there. For one, my bust line needs to be coaxed more to the front, so I know I need to move some of the curve away from the side. There's also too much room in the front and side hip area, especially in the front. And at the back waist, I'm getting some fabric scrunching. This is probably due to my sway back. I'd also like to see more curve in the waist, so I might bring that in all the way around. With those changes in mind, I adjusted my pattern pieces. I also split the center front into two to give the bust more curve in the front. Now I'm taking a bit of a risk by skipping a second mock-up and jumping straight into my coutil, but I'm giving myself extra wide seam allowances just in case. Second mock-up, better fit in most places. I definitely took out too much from these side hips. Need to add a little bit more back into that area. My only major issue now is that it's pulling right about here. But since this area is full of ribs, it's not squishy like my waist, so I need to add more space there. And I think I want to change the curve over the hips, but I'll work on that later on down the road. I took my whole mock-up apart, transferred my adjustments to the coutil, and trimmed up all those pieces. I used the coutil pieces to cut out the taffeta, and it was a pretty tight fit. This black fabric is left over from a Regency Spencer I made a couple years ago, and I didn't have much left to begin with. I learned my lesson from the last time I worked with taffeta and basted my layers together first before sewing all the main seams of the corset. And look what has arrived! I bought 1/2-inch straight steel bones for the center back, 10 yards of synthetic whalebone. Looking at this stuff, it is certainly more substantial than the plastic kind that you can buy at a big box fabric store. A grommet setter tool, as well as several dozen sets of grommets in size 00, which was the smallest size available. This twill tape is for the waist stay, a couple lengths of lacing, and lastly, and most excitingly, I bought a spoon busk. This thing costs like 3 times the price of a regular straight busk, but I've never used one of these before and I wanted to try it out. Since spoon busks were invented in 1876, and since this corset is shorter than what would have been normal for the late 1870s natural form era, for historical accuracy purposes, I'm going to consider this corset more of a mid to late 1880s style. Sewing around the curved end of the busk was tricky, so I had to sew it multiple times to get close enough to the edge. And of course, I broke my needle when I hit the metal busk. So much for doing things the right way the first time. Such ambition, so little hubris. Well, I was about to put in the grommets. I even did a couple test versions. When I realized that my plan for how to do the boning in this isn't gonna work. So originally my plan was to do a single layer corset. By single layer, I mean just coutil, but no lining. Single layer corsets were pretty common in the late 19th century. What they would have instead is bone casing to cover the bones. And I have had this stuff in my stash for 5 years. because when I went to make my original corset, I bought a kit and the stuff came with this kit, but that corset was lined, so I didn't need to use this. So I really wanted to use it, and now I can't because I have to make a lining. And I don't want to make a lining, but I have to. After I begrudgingly cut and assembled my lining out of cotton muslin, I added it to the main body of the corset and hand basted the layers in place. That took me about an hour and a half, but the lining is in place. So it's hard not to feel a little discouraged when I spent the equivalent of an entire nap to do a step that I didn't really want to do in the first place. But hey, that's how it goes. I'm working on my placement of my grommets now. And on this side, it's 3/4 inch apart, each grommet, and then this side, it's 1 inch. So I need to decide which way I want to go with this. But I have yet another problem. I bought 2 1/2 inch wide flat steels to go in these back channels. I ordered 11 inch long bones and they are about a 1/2 inch too short. I don't know if I measured wrong or something happened in all of my pattern changes, but they're too short. And you may be thinking, well, it's just a 1/2 inch shorter. That's not gonna make much of a difference. But it does, it totally does. So now I need to decide, do I shorten the length of the back to match my bones, or do I order new bones? I decided to go with more grommets closer together, so I spaced them according to an assumed 12 inch long center back bone and went to town poking holes in my fabric. I'm using an awl. Actually, I'm using 2 awls because the tip of my good awl is bent. So I use my white awl to get started and then switch to my purple one. My grommet kit came with a punch tool, but I don't actually want to cut any of the threads of my fabric because that would weaken it. And these holes are small enough to make with an awl. All 32 of them. While I wait for my second supply order to arrive, I'm moving on to sewing the boning channels. I found these neat little washi tapes, and they were the perfect width for the boning channels. So this is the back, and I kind of want some angled ones on the back, and then some angled ones on the front side, and then maybe a curvy one, and then some shorter ones. So I think I'm now going to try to do as much of this as I can while the baby is asleep. Next came cutting and filing these synthetic whale bones. Since I have so many bones, I'm using a Dremel tool to file down the ends. I would definitely recommend wearing eye protection for this. I'd also recommend doing it outside and wearing a mask, which I later did because this process is quite dusty. It is evening now, and I've actually gotten a lot of work done on this corset. So this is what it looks like on the inside. There's my waist stay, which actually really helps reduce the strain on these seam lines. So now I'm just waiting for the center back bones to arrive, and then I can insert those. But in the meantime, I made bias binding to go on the top and bottom edges. So I can at least install it on the top, and I'll leave the bottom side open so that I can slip those bones in and then finish that. I'm adding the binding on first by machine, then finishing it by hand. I have to trim down the seam allowances so I can keep the finished binding really narrow. I'm hoping to avoid that pulling effect that my original corset has. to leave an opening at the center back to add the straight steel bones when they arrive, but until then I can work on the last step, flossing. So I did a little sampler idea of what I wanted to do, and I didn't really like most of these, and my hands started getting tired, so what I did is I went on my computer in Adobe Illustrator and drew up some patterns, and that's what this one ended up being. And I didn't really like that either, so I went back to this other one that I did and did it again. This was with 3 threads, this was with 2, so I think I'm gonna go with the skinnier version. I should say that I am not an embroiderer, and if you're thinking, isn't embroidery just fancy hand sewing? Well, yes, but there's much more to it than that. With embroidery, you have to worry about stitch tension and balance and length and stitch consistency, and I can't use a hoop when embroidering a corset, and there are 3 layers of fabric, including very thick couture, which makes this even harder. All that being said, I am trying my best here. I've been working for about 2 hours and this is what I have done. So I finished 14 of these flossing ends and oh, that feels so slow. I'm looking at like at least 10 hours of work just on embroidery. And to compare, I could sew like a 120-inch skirt hem by hand in 2 hours. So this feels achingly slow. I just hope that the more I do it, the faster I get. So I'm just gonna keep going. I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss, which is not the strongest thread ever made, but it's what I have on hand and I want to use it. And I won't be wearing this thing every day, so I don't need it to hold up forever. So how does this new and improved corset compare? Well, I think the shape is much better. I mean, look at that hip spring. The angled bones in front really help support the bust. I still think there's a little extra room in the front hips, but it's not too concerning. The grommets are smaller, which makes a big difference both visually and structurally. The narrow binding means I don't have that pulling in the center of the corset either, so that's a big win. I'm also very glad that I added the waist stay. That's something I'll be adding to all my corsets from now on. And while the flossing isn't perfect, because the design is so busy, it's a little hard to tell unless you're really looking for irregularities. The spoon busk didn't result in a super curvy line like I was expecting, but I suppose I could just bend it more to get that look. I also ended up buying black lacing because I thought that would look better. Overall, I'm really proud of the work I put into this project, and it took me far less time to make this corset than any of my previous corsets, even including the time I spent on mock-ups. And the end result, both in looks and fit, is vastly improved from my corset from 5 years ago. And now I want to make all the corsets. Good thing I now have a stockpile of supplies that I can use in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and let me know in the comments if you've never made a corset before and what your very first corset was like. See you next time.